One second. Good morning, team. Good morning. The sun is up, right? The sun's up. Bitcoin's running. We've got some lightning node trouble, apparently, right? Some things not going great. Some fighting, some stuff. We're not going to cover that here. We're not experts in that stuff. But, Bitcoin is still running, so we can have our coffee and talk about the news. Now, let me just see what's up here. Great. Yeah, some reason this thing is crashing sometimes before. I hope everyone made it. Don't know why. But we've got a great show. Maybe the best show I've ever done. This is going to change your life. We're going to be talking about Punk 6529. If you Bitcoiners don't know who Punk 6529 is, I'd say he is a Bitcoiner, but deep into the NFT world and all that. But still, a really great voice and someone who I think Bitcoiners should listen to, follow, think about. But I'm going to respond and say that something he wrote yesterday, no good, wrong, and we'll get into it. We're going to be talking all about fear today, and the first story I want to bring up, this is kind of funny. You got to go see the videos. In Iran, you got the mullahs, right? The clerics, and they wear these like white puffy hats. Well, it's become a trend now, and I've seen a few videos. Iran, there's a lot of protests going on there. I'm not an expert in everything that's going on over there and don't follow a lot of it, just the big moving pieces and sort of what's going on. I know the story with the hijab and the women and the mullahs, and I know enough of the history, but don't come here for updates on Iran other than this. And if you do want some updates on Iran, I know Q, my colleague at Bitcoin Magazine, who runs the Bitcoin Magazine live show, he's one of the hosts in the afternoon, has a lot to say about it. So, he's probably a better follow on what's going on exactly in Iran. But so these guys come with the white hats, and then kids and teenagers and protesters are running up and knocking their hat off, right? Like a prank thing. But of course, it's not the same as Halloween pranks in America, right? If you're going around mocking clerics in Iran, you're going to have a lot of trouble. But it's significant, and this is why it's significant. I think, once again, not an Iranian expert at all. Do not come here for your opinions on Iran, other than this one, which is fears, right? Fears, what people are afraid of, can actually be indicated in language in a really interesting and fun way. And you can get a sense of what fear is and how it's used, persuasion and things like that from that. And it's this: in every language, the swear words end up being what that society fears the most. And you can do a survey of your language if you don't speak English as a native language, but you can even see the difference between English in America and English in England, because the cultures are different, therefore the fears are different, and therefore the insults are different. And so that's my point, is that insults in any language are directly related to the subconscious fears of that society. And I'll do a little survey here to let you know how this works. So a great comparison, right? Morning, Dex, morning, audio. Here's a great comparison in French, really neat and tidy. In France, all the swear words are about being an inadequate lover, right? Putain means a whore, you got to pay for sex, right? Bordel, you drop milk in France, you say bordel, right? Brothel. It's all swear words about having to pay for sex because you can't do it yourself. You're not good enough to get the woman or the man or whoever it is. And therefore, you got to use a cash transaction because you couldn't do it with your charm or your ability to attract people. In Quebec, on the other hand, those words mean nothing. Putain. I mean, the national dish in Quebec can almost be pronounced as the swear word in France. It's Poutine. And it's a weird thing because Vladimir Putin has to spell his name in French in the Quebec poutine way. It's spelled as poutine, like the French fries, gravy, and cheese. Because if they'd spell it Putin, as we do in English, I think the real transliteration of his name from Cyrillic, his alphabet in Russia, then it comes out as putain, like the swear word. So he's got to write it as the French fries and cheese and gravy. But the swear words in Quebec have nothing to do with those in France. You couldn't say, they don't matter. What they all are in Quebec is against the religion. So in Quebec, if you want to swear, you say tabernacle. wafer, chalice. I mean, the one of the worst things you can say in Quebec is chalice wafer, right? Like that, you can start a fight by saying that, right? You chalice wafer person, it's on, right? And we're gonna pound each other. And now in England, you can see it too. In England, it's all Victorian principles of the body. A bit of swear. Obviously, I'll warn you now. There's swear words coming because this is a little bit about swearing. Fuck, shit, all that stuff, right? Dick, asshole. It's all stuff from the body, right? Now, American English has inherited that stuff, but it's not what would get you to fight. Like, you can't go up to someone in America and say, you fucker, fucking shit. Like that. It's not going to really do anything. In America, it's all about really these factors, right? You can be a poor loser. Like being a loser in America, like if you see two people about to fight, the word loser will get it done, right? You fucking loser, bang, right? That's how it's going to happen. Status, right? It's basically just being a low status, poor person. Now, I can do a few others. I speak a bit of Korean. I lived in Korea for years. You know what the word to get a fight going in Korea is? Puppy. Not they have to use the English word puppy to talk about cute puppies, because in the Confucian world, in the world order, in the world view, the worst thing you can be is subhuman, but then young, right? So you're lower than human, but you're the young version. So it's the Confucian order of things, right? So they say, gesakya, right? That means you're puppy, you puppy, right? That's anytime you watch a Korean movie and they're fighting, they're yelling, or the dramas, right? It's all puppy. They're just saying puppy. They can say other ones like babo, right? Babo means you're confused and stupid and not like in line with everyone. You're a little eccentric, right? Babo can be an endearing thing. Oh, you babo, right? Ah, you silly, weird person. But it's also a way to start a fight, right? Let's fight. Like, you fucking babo, you different puppy, right? Let's go, right? And I think you can do this all around the world. I've checked it with all kinds of people in their country. I've used this explanation a few times, and it sort of checks out. So I'm not going to try to litigate it in every language, but it looks more or less, to me anyway, like it applies. But this whole piece of fear and what it means and how it motivates people ends up being really important, because fears are actually one of maybe the most influential state that the human mind can be in order to make decisions. It trumps everything else. Fear is the most important persuasive tool in any toolkit for people persuading. It's just the most important. People will prioritize what makes them afraid over other things. So today we're going to argue a little bit about how Satoshi changed. We've heard about he changed the rationale for violence and those kinds of things. Well, I'm going to show it a bit from a different angle. It's the same story, so it's not so different than what you've heard before from the point of view that Satoshi changed the logic of violence and all those kinds of things. Totally true, not arguing against that. This is just another way to say the same thing, but I think really helpful, because it shows what people are motivated by and how much things are about to change because of this. So the first piece here in the fiat world, right? As I mentioned, the swear words and insults can be categorized in these ways, right? People are afraid of conflict. They're afraid of poverty. It's a major issue in America to be poor, and no one wants to be poor, right? Of course, easy. And no one wants to have low status, right? We're going to talk about Bitcoin's fears, right? They're right here. Bitcoin also has its fears, right? It's not immune from projecting its fears. They are often leadership, poor leadership, right? There's a fear amongst Bitcoiners of poor leadership. There's a fear amongst Bitcoiners that markets can be manipulated, that they're fake, that the science, the math, everything behind it isn't real, and therefore presents unique challenges to Bitcoin, because if Bitcoin acts relative to a fake thing, it takes meaning out of Bitcoin and perhaps can take away its steam. The other one would be interest, right? Bitcoiners do fear no one interested in the technology, and the dopamine dealers, the people who exist off of inciting outrage and fear and excitement and low time preference and, or sorry, high time preference and, consume, all that kind of stuff, right? That is an enemy of Bitcoin. Bitcoiners will say that the dopamine merchants, the attention merchants, are an enemy of Bitcoin. And so there's a fear for that. And you can see the fears, right? That's why the insults come from it, right? You hear people say like shitcoiner, no leaders. You hear people say, on the interest piece, why, that's where the whole time preference comes from, right? When you see someone with really high time preference, just consuming data, information, thrills, and all that kind of stuff, right? That's sort of an insult in Bitcoin, right? If you don't have the ability to plan ahead, if you live too much for the moment, for the thrill, like that, you can use that as an insult in the Bitcoin world. And it's usually used to say like, well, this person, maybe not. So we can start to see these things play out. And what we're going to argue here is that the way Satoshi changed it and the way the world is playing out today, all the news, we're going to go through the news stories. We're going to show that basically the fiat world is no longer able to mobilize these fear factors the way they once did. And that the fear factors that are becoming more important are actually the ones that Bitcoiners are already attuned to. So what I'm arguing is that the way Satoshi changed, the things we're afraid of, are more in tune with the way the world is headed, and Bitcoin more appropriately manages the fears that we have on a day-to-day basis and the anxieties we have as a people, not as Bitcoiners, as a people on a day-to-day basis. And I'll show you how. So the first one here, poverty, right? Poverty. Well, can the fiat system, can the encoded world of language that the American culture has created and all of the cultural pieces, what it's all geared towards is, and it's been successful at making, us not poor, right? It had a long track record, but unfortunately now we're in a situation where poverty is starting to run rampant, and we know about the Cantillon effect, which is the widening gap between rich and poor. And if you go out in any American city, you're going to see an utter collapse. You saw Bukele, the president of El Salvador, on Tucker Carlson yesterday, and that's one of the things he said. He's like, I'm from a developing third world country in Central America. There's most American cities I wouldn't live there. I go through them and I say I wouldn't live there. He said Philadelphia, Baltimore, on. And we know that in America, if you go through these cities, they're run down, deteriorating, and rotten. And this fear of poverty, while still there, is being handled in this way, right? Look at what we hear. So yesterday you had Joe Biden in Florida, the president of the United States, and he made a double-gaffe, right? Now we can't expect too much from him. He's got major mental problems, way too old. But here's what he said, right? He's in Florida. He says, inflation is a worldwide problem right now. So don't worry about America. It's everywhere. Because of the war in Iraq, what? And the impact on oil and what Russia's doing. Excuse me, the war in Ukraine. So he changes his mind from the war in Iraq to the war in Ukraine, and then says, I'm thinking of Iraq because that's where my son died. His son didn't die in Iraq, right? Now, I don't want to laugh. It's sad. His son sort of died in Iraq in that he probably was poisoned as an active serviceman in Iraq, but then died of cancer in America years after he was in his tour in Iraq. So here we've got an entire problem of inflation raging across the world, and you've got a president who is incapable of even talking about the problem, right? He can't even get the story straight on what his talking points are to deflect. He can't even do that, right? He can't even do that. Now, you can say that this was one of the reasons why the fiat system persisted, because it did increase wealth and it did manage to suppress inflation for a generation. I mean, I've never known it in my whole life. I have no idea what it is until the financial crisis of 2008. It didn't exist, right? It had been engineered away from globalization and all kinds of reasons. But poverty was not a concern in the sense that the trajectory was more or less exactly in the direction you wanted. It was being fixed all around the world in the worst parts, and we were getting richer. So it wasn't really a factor, and the system could perpetuate. But now that it is such a huge factor, that inflation is there, the ability for the system to actually alleviate the fear that they have created is down. But the next one here gets even more to the point about how these fears are simply changing and not being fixed. And this comes from the DHS piece. Now, first of all, this whole DHS thing that came out yesterday, like, I got one thing to say about it before we get on. Didn't we, the DHS yesterday said there's been collusion between government authorities and the social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, etc. But didn't we know this already? Like, what? I'm just curious about why yesterday everyone was like, oh my God, is it because it was in paper? Because we finally saw the actual mechanics? But the mechanics were more or less what we all imagined, right? So I see this story as already having gone through a media cycle and is being resuscitated. Fine, right? But I think we already knew this. But nevertheless, the important thing that came out of it that I saw, we'll get into some of the details, but Li Fang, the person who did it. Now, remember, the media is there, right? The media is there to inform us, theoretically, help prepare us, give us information, and those kinds of things, right? Help us all navigate what's going on in the world. Conflict is not something people enjoy, right? They don't enjoy conflict. They're afraid of conflict. People don't want to fight. They don't want to have an altercation. They don't want to have an argument. They don't want those things, right? I think people want, things to go over well and for there not to be conflict. It's a normal thing. So this Li Fang goes yesterday, brings what I said is maybe not so much the hugest news ever, because we kind of knew already, but nevertheless should have been dealt with, talked about. The fears that he raised should have been, conferred upon by journalists. But of course, the only reaction we got yesterday, and this is what Leighton Woodhouse said on Twitter, was the absolute epitome of the media industry is Li Fang dropping a blockbuster story of national importance. And the response from journalists on Twitter is to line up to scold him for appearing on Tucker Carlson. Just like Bukele, he went on Tucker Carlson the same day that he did the thing. And of course, that's the big story, right? So no way, we can't have that. And it goes further, right? What we see with Twitter is this effort now to target advertisers of Twitter, right? So Mike Solana writes, pro-censorship journalists, activists, and state propagandists, misinformation experts, are targeting Twitter's advertisers in a last-ditch effort to destroy the company. And he writes a whole article about it. And he brought up some really interesting points. He's like, okay, these are the guys that asked for this system in place in order to maintain the veracity of information and those kinds of things. So they want to perpetuate the system that's already there. But remember the story we covered here, the Twitter advertiser, the Twitter employees that got fired, but it was really a troll, and it was just actors or trolls that went and pretended that they were getting fired, and the media covered it straight, right? They couldn't tell the difference. Not only could they not tell the difference, it took them 3 days. It took them 3 days from when the story was first broadcast to when it was retracted, because they had to retract it. Now, remember, we even titled our story that day, "It's Going Up Forever, Deirdre," because the journalist that fell for it the hardest was Deirdre. It was the same Deirdre that questioned Samson Mao and Sailor that day. Is it going up forever, guys? And they both had to say, "It's going up forever, Deirdre, forever." Right? That's the same Deirdre who helped amplify the story and took 3 days to retract. So right away, you got to know the capacity of these people, right? And that's really what it comes down to, right? That the Rahul Ligma and Daniel Johnson story being taken so long to be corrected by a media entity is the same media entity that wishes to suppress points of view and is asking for special favor in concocting, how we orchestrate what information gets to the public and what doesn't. So again, the system of speech control that is jumping up around Elon Musk now understands that it can't use the bureaucracies anymore. It can't use the collusion between government and big tech. It's got to now target the advertisers, because otherwise there's going to be conflict. People are going to fight about things that people say. And that's what's not wanted, right? You've got to maintain an official narrative, and anything that deviates from the narrative is conflict, therefore must be avoided. And the logic is afraid of the conflict, because if we just have one point of view, then we're not going to have the conflict, and that's optimal, right? But of course, we know it's not, because when you look at what happened with Twitter, if we look at what happened with the targeting of what they were going to suppress, of course, we know now that they were going to target any discussion of inflation, of changing financial circumstances, or subversive financial technology like Bitcoin. And that was clear in their mandate, that they didn't want toxic narratives to enter the financial system, right? They didn't want toxic narratives, which would lead to conflict, right? So again, their fears led them to make a choice, which in the end is probably not going to work out for them, and we'll get to that, right? The next one here is status, right? And this is great, right? So I think both Naval and Balaji put it perfect. Naval said, charging the blue check moves it from a status symbol to a utilitarian one. It elicits shrieks because it's more about leveling the playing field than making money. That was Naval. Balaji said the blue checks wanted to abolish billionaires in the name of equality. The billionaire will end up abolishing the blue checks in the name of equality. So, and remember, Balaji goes through the whole history. It was actually created at first because celebrities were sick of having the spoof accounts and wanted some remediation. So it was created at the time, right? Cernovich goes on to say there's 10,000 people who want a blue check and would pay for every thought leader but hurt that their relative internet social status will decline if it's opened up. I only got mine years ago because dozens of impersonations. Opening up the blue check is well overdue. And of course, we saw just a masterclass in persuasion from Elon Musk, where, and this comes from something that Trump used very regularly, where you go way overboard in negotiations. And Trump even describes this whole technique in The Art of the Deal. You ask for way more so that when it looks like you're compromising, you're actually getting what you want, right? So we saw that whole thing, and it's amazing. We saw the richest writer in the history of America and the richest person in America arguing about live about Twitter access, and arguing about the difference between $8 and $20, so a $12 difference. The richest journalist and the richest man in America arguing about $12. Amazing stuff, right? Especially in the context of poverty and all the rest. But it definitely puts the status piece into focus. But now we can start contrasting to what's actually going on and what's important, right? So right now you can see the fiat world, right, trying to grapple with these things, right? We don't want conflict. What about our status, right? If you don't let us do this stuff, everyone's going to be poor. We're the ones who can prevent poverty, even though it's not exactly it. Now, Bitcoin's fear factors, right, are different, right? I'm arguing that they're leadership, markets, and interest. And when I say leadership, what I mean is we've never really seen competition like we do now between leadership responses, and what happens when you have a good leader and a bad leader, right? Good leadership versus bad leadership. In America's salad days and its heydays, it didn't matter. Go back to the 2000 election. I mean, did it really matter? In the end, it mattered, but Al Gore and George Bush in that election had basically the same platform. There was hardly any contrast between the leaders. And that contrast, the lack of contrast between leaders, stayed for quite a while, right? Until we got to Obama, not even Obama Romney. They didn't have that much apart in the end, right? It was a few different policy objectives. Remember, they both agreed on the healthcare stuff in the 2012 election. They had a bit of a disagreement about Russia versus ISIS, right? Romney was sure that it was Russia and all that stuff. But nevertheless, we haven't really seen the contrast. But now that the world has changed so much, now that different states responded differently to COVID, we're starting to see the actual comparison, horse to horse, against each other, straight race, why leadership matters. And if you take a look at yesterday, go back to the poverty question, right? You had Fetterman, right? the brain, the guy with the no brain, right? Talk about his brain. So he goes on Don Lemon, right? Maybe the dumbest person on TV. And the two of them, the guy who can't talk, right? We know he's incapable of talking, right? Fetterman is on TV with Don Lemon. And they're trying to have like a conversation, but there's not enough brain cells between them all to finish the job. But here's what it sounds like. And remember, like we got poverty, but we're worried in Bitcoin about leadership. The poverty part, less, right? The leadership part, important. That's why we don't want leaders in Bitcoin, right? We don't want leaders. They're failures. They can be failures. But there's still a difference between good leadership and bad leadership, right? And how leadership is exercised. But here we go. So Don Lemon says, what do you think the biggest cause of inflation is? And should the Biden administration be doing more? Fetterman says, addressing inflation is making sure that those rates are brought back into line with what they should have been able to fight the deficit. And then he goes on to say that it was Trump's tax cuts that caused it from a couple of years ago, right? Trump's tax cuts a couple of years ago. So right away here, the contrast between poverty just not even being handled by the leadership versus what we do with leaders, how we deal with them, and what we expect of them, right? Huge difference. So in the end, my argument is, and if you look at people like Greta Thunberg, right? Greta was in the UK she's there for this some kind of a thing in London. I don't know what it is. The Royal Festival Hall. She was at a children's crusade, all about environmental stuff. And she really threw her lot in with the left-wing folks the last couple of days. She came out in her book and said, like, forget about environment. It's patriarchy, it's capitalism, it's all these other things, right? You can guess what it is, right? It's the same playbook as you've heard a million times. And, look at what happened. Look at what happened from following her for, what has it been, 4 years now, 3 years now, right? Look at Europe. This is what happens when you have leaders that are so bad. They made this girl a leader. I mean, they made her a leader. And that's the problem. That's why we love that Satoshi ran away. I did the media tour. I did a couple interviews the other day for the birthday. And, it kept coming up, like, what about Satoshi, right? What are we going to find? I was like, what? We don't want to find him. We don't care. Like, Satoshi gone, we don't need to find Satoshi. Satoshi left us with enough. We have enough, right? We don't need more Satoshi, because all that it's going to do is anything we find out that's negative will paint Bitcoin in that light, right? He'll be associated. You'll understand guilt through association. And therefore it's better that no one knows, and we shouldn't even look. Who cares? It doesn't matter, right? Bitcoin doesn't need the leader that Satoshi was. It's not needed, right? And that's why Bitcoiners remain fearful of leadership just as a vehicle to change the world, right? It's according to Bitcoiners and according to myself, less appropriate than it ever has been, right? So examples like Fetterman, go to China now and look at what leadership, if that doesn't scare you. So, their isolation processes are breaking down in China. Their ability to quarantine individuals and all that stuff is getting more and more rough, more and more made up, more and more just written on the back of an envelope. And we saw yesterday they had created these holding cells all in a row, and it just looks like plastic wrapped cages. And someone took a video, and you should hear the moaning shrieks, and they're not like, let me out. They're just like, give up shrieks, right? Like, this is just the worst. They're sitting in the sun in a whole row in these things, waiting to be, like, I guess, picked up into a truck and moved to another quarantine place. I mean, really, really gross stuff. And the reasons why Bitcoiners are so afraid of leaders, right? So this is going on now, right? Now, what about markets, right? That's a thing that Bitcoiners, now, I wouldn't say we're afraid of free markets. We're afraid of manipulated markets, right? Of course. And that's what the point of markets and all of the financial engineering brings up. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we all Bitcoin, because we understand that the financial engineering that went into creating Wall Street the way it is now is mostly fluff, mostly self-referential. It's a type of narcissism, right? And just looking in the mirror saying, like, we got to do more of this, right? More of this. That's great. More financial engineering. And that's what's caused our best and brightest for a whole generation now to go to Wall Street, because that's where the most money was. And that's the part that I think has Bitcoiners nervous, that you've got the smartest people working in a market without real things to produce other than more financial activity, right? More financial engineering. And so the manipulation of markets itself becomes something that Bitcoiners are inherently afraid of. And that's what we're seeing all over the place, right? So now we've got Saifedean, who came out yesterday commenting on a Wall Street Journal story. This is the Wall Street Journal. Rocky Treasury market trading rattles Wall Street. So Saif comes out and says, this is hugely important. Deep liquidity is what makes treasuries the de facto money of the world. The world's biggest institutions hold as cash the assets which they can buy and sell in large quantities quickest, with the least slippage. So what he's saying is, now that this is happening, it's actually the treasury bills are actually losing one of the most important qualities that make them what they are. Their attractiveness is leaving, right? And lots of people go on about what all this means. It's been going on for a few days now. And related to it, there's another story about all these mystery buyers from central banks that are buying up gold. Turkey, Qatar. You've got that story running in Forbes. Who are the mystery buyers responsible for central bank gold boom? And then at the same time, you've got the central bank thing going on. You've got the treasuries. You've got everything we know about England and the gilts. We've got currency manipulation at a scale we have no idea about in China right now, trying to help the yuan. We found out a little bit about Japan. It was, I think, if I heard it was 6 trillion yen. If I'm incorrect, that's $60 billion, something like that. I might have said 600 yesterday. I think it's 60 billion. Anyway, it's a lot of money, right? They're just sitting there burning this money in order to keep their currency stable. So there's a reason why we're worried about market depth and market performance and all these things, right? The next would be interest. And this is where I start to disagree with Punk 6529, and I'll get into it. So Bitcoiners are interested in this factor here and are afraid because the dopamine dealers that would make you have a CBDC, make you trade your personal information in order to consume, in order to see, in order to consume images, even like if pornography, for example, required some form of KYC, right, or something like that to access the internet and have a real world personality attached to it. Of course, you would have a lot of people freaked out, and Bitcoiners would understand that this would be a super effective tool, right? Super effective, because it would just force people to share their personal information in order to consume things, which we already see is rampant, right? So the argument that I've always said will exist for UBI and CBDCs is that it'll be the way to the only way to qualify for this free money will be to share your personal information and let the policymakers dictate where you spend, what you spend on, how you consume, and it might be things that people agree with too, right? Don't forget, it might be like, okay, we're going to give you UBI, CBDC payments, but they can't be used at Walmart, right? So attractive things like that are coming for these systems, and it'll be programmed only to be used in mom and pop shops in your town, right? They did that in Korea during COVID. Right, it's possible. I saw it in Korea during COVID. I didn't go there during COVID, but I know people who lived like that. You know, as I said, I lived in Korea, and that was really going on. Right, they did it in a way that everyone agreed with. That's why there was no big stink. Right, they just said, well, we're going to give you airdrop money, but it won't work at Walmart and other stores. It'll only work at small grocers, small diners. They even geo-fenced it as far as they knew you weren't allowed out of your little dong. They're called neighborhoods in Korea, your dong, right? They kept you in your dong. And it only worked there, right? It only worked there. So interest and this dopamine dealing enemy has long been a worry for Bitcoiners because, whoops, chat overlay, what just happened? I just lost the chat. 1 second, guys. Don't know why. Huh. Oh, there we go. I don't know why I did that, guys. I lost the chat and it logged me out for a second, so glad everyone's still here. So here's what Punk 65291 said, right? So he made a list of reasons why the United States could shut Bitcoin down in a moment. And what he argued was, let me just find these arguments. So what he argued, he gave a list of things that could happen. It was like 30-day redeemability, and made the argument that only people like LOP and the people that don't keep any Bitcoin on exchanges would make it, because all it would require would be the fiat to crypto gateway to be closed, and that would basically end the whole industry. And he likened it again to the gold thing from the 1930s and said, how far away are we from that happening again, right? And his argument here is like, well, the things we can do about it, memes, he's correct, right? Put another layer of defense, a free speech layer of defense, a mimetic layer of defense, a First Amendment protected layer of defense in place. Something that could bridge chains, float through social media, live off chain, show up in rallies, memes, right? So he's saying he had two other, adoption, he said, is one way out. If we just pump adoption really quick, we'll get out. Do the grind of lobbying, right? Explain to the politicians, do the grind, all that kind of stuff. What I'm arguing is none of those things are going to matter, right? None of those things are going to matter. The fear, the fault line, like I said, of violence, right? We understand, and that is mimetically understood amongst most Bitcoiners. We've already all sort of explained that the logic of violence changes with Bitcoin, right? So the logic of violence just being that you're not protecting a system that gives value to assets. You're protecting actually the assets. Lowry made this argument, right? That instead of protecting, a bank, a physical building, a physical property, by only having energy and the actual users and having Bitcoin as the actual asset, you've totally altered strategically what people are going to move on, people are going to destroy and attack. And his logic looks pretty sound, and I've done a few shows on his logic around that before. What I'm saying here is that the fears that fiat perpetuated, status, conflict, poverty, they're already all wasted. They can't keep milking them, right? People are poor. People are fighting nonstop because of the dopamine dealers. The dopamine dealers here have created this problem and made it worse, right? What about status, right? Status. Well, we know now that the blue check is so threatening to those folks because it is all about status. What if we go one step further? What if we say you can't even mention what university you went to in a job application? You just went to university or didn't go to university, right? These types of things are coming. The ability to leverage status going forward is what is leaving the world, right? And when we see Elon Musk and when we see these fights now breaking out on Twitter that are not as manipulated as they once were, and we see poverty breaking out across our country and way worse, Fiat's ability to manage its own fears is basically finished, right? They can't even manage the very things that were a priority in the minds of the people from that world. They're all sort of dopamined out, right? When they say you're tired and creative but you can't be creative because you're too tired, and they say it's like your endocrine system is tapped out, right? Well, a lot of that has to do with just these things being squeezed to the point where there's nothing left, right? You can't actually, if everyone's poor, you can't make them afraid of being poor. If everyone's fighting, you can't make them afraid of more fighting, right? So they were trying to protect, the DHS and the social media guys. They were trying to have this like pleasant experience on the internet where we all talk about what was written in the Atlantic and, whether it was right or wrong. That's not what happened. People reject the Atlantic, don't want to hear anything about the psyops and the spin inside of it, and don't want to read it, right? And so you weren't able to have this nice reaction to the Atlantic. It was more, get rid of these newspapers. Why is another billionaire telling us all how to live, right? It was just more conflict. So the argument here is that these things are not even in play anymore. They're not even in play. They're just finished, right? There's poor people. We're fighting all the time. And status is, no one cares, right? They used to care. They care less. If you can make your case on the internet, if you can, do what we do in this show, right? Citizen journalism, that's why I'm doing it, right? You can tell these days the difference between authentic voices and inauthentic voices. There's nothing more obvious. There's nothing more obvious these days. Nothing, right? And I work on this show to just try and tell you what I think exactly, not try and put some spin on it that makes me look smart or whatever. I'm just trying to give you the way I see the world on a day-to-day basis and how I react to the news and how it comes in. That's it, right? And I think it's useful. So that's why I do the show, right? So status, and I'm not worried about if I'm blue checked or what school I went to. I mean, I let you know that I went to this school and that school, just so you know that I've done enough work and have the skills at least to measure, analyze, and synthesize information. But that's it. Like, I'm not telling you should listen to me because I went to law school. I don't care, right? It doesn't do me any good. I know a lot of idiots who went to law school that I went to law school with, right? Really dumb people. But here's why the Bitcoin world and our fears are about to become the most important, because they're literally all that we need to fix in the world, right? We need to fix leadership. Right? That's a major fear of Bitcoiners. We want to diminish the power of leadership. You know why we talked about why we love Trump and why we love Biden, right? We love Trump and Biden because they were both great for showing the problems of leadership, right? They're great. Like, I can't think of a better president. I want 4 more years of Biden, 4 more years. Now, it's sad to say because it's going to increase poverty, conflict. It's not going to be good, right? So easy for me to say. So I don't really want it because I don't want to increase any suffering, right? So I say it disingenuously, but I can't deny that 4 more years of that guy babbling on would just be the perfect image for the dollar, the perfect image for the United States, for me, right? For me, for what I'm interested in. So we want 4 more years. Let's go, Biden. We love you. Of course, there's other people, right? But now we are going to see, especially with COVID and the results, especially in the United States, because the United States, with its 50 states, with every state being a sovereign nation, we're going to understand that again, what that means. We forgot, the Civil War in the United States, World War II, consolidated so much power under DC, the federal government, that we think of the United States as a country. The United States is. No. Before the Civil War, it was the United States are, right? The United States are. And I think we're headed back to a world where we're going to say the states are, not even united, right? Less united, just the states, because they're all different. And we're seeing right away what Florida's policies give them. Arizona is going to change so much. Arizona is about to change so much. And we're going to see the difference in leadership, right? We're going to see what happens when you have different policies, different leaders, and it's an apples to apples comparison because it's America. It's not comparing the United States and all of its complexity to Sweden, right? That's stupid, right? We're going to compare Florida to North Carolina, to Virginia, right? We're going to compare New York to Texas, right? We can do that all day now, right? We can see very clearly. I drove up the US East Coast in 2001 or 2021, after Bitcoin Miami 2021. I stayed about 6 weeks in Florida, and then I had to cross the border on land in order to avoid the quarantine because of the the needles, and if you didn't have it and you flew, then they threw you in the quarantine. But if you drove, you could tell them, oh, yeah, I'm going to my house. One of my house, don't worry, right? So I flew my kids to New York City, drove the car, picked them up, drove across the border, and say, yeah, we'll see you soon, going to the thing. And of course, then you do what you got to do. But we enjoyed our summer and all the rest of it. I could see on that drive going from Florida and then into the states that had different COVID policies. I arrived in Richmond, Virginia, Virginia being a blue state that had shut everything down. And I went into the nicest hotel because it was actually a NHL hockey game. The Stanley Cup was going on at the time, and I'm a fan. I don't watch a lot of games, but it was the finals, and I said I'll stop my car and go listen to my team from Montreal, and rented a nice hotel room and ordered, went down to and I'm staying in the nicest, oldest hotel in the city, right? And I got the rooftop, and it was beautiful, right? And I go down to the lady at the desk, and I said, where can I go for food? She says, there's no food around here. I said, what do you mean there's no food around here? She said, well, everything's closed. I said, what do you mean everything's closed? It's COVID. And I said, is it COVID? Okay, but things are open. And she goes, no, they're bankrupt. They're out of business. And I said, what do you mean out of business? Like, no one is open? And she says, well, you can go to the 7-Eleven, but you got to get through all the drug addicts out front. And I said, well, I don't know. Okay. So I had to order Uber Eats from some, out of town. Like, they had to come into downtown. I'm downtown. There should be restaurants everywhere, right? But she told me right there, no, it's done. It's done. We don't do that. So right away, I could tell the difference, and if you'd just been coming from Florida, which was totally normal, right? Nothing was closed. Everything was open. There was no masks. There was nothing in 2021. You just lived your life, right? You just went around. Some people wore masks. Some people didn't. No one cared, right? And I don't care about masks either, right? I just, so you guys know, I don't think that if you wear a mask, I don't care, right? Wear it, don't wear it. I lived in Asia. They wear masks normally. I'm used to it. If you feel like wearing one, wear one, right? I don't wear one. I don't like them. I hate them. I hated them when I lived there in Asia, and I don't like them now, so I don't wear them. But my point is that they've exhausted these and their ability to scare people because they're just reality. We're swimming in this. So how could you possibly be afraid? 1 second. Not yet, sweetie. Now, the Bitcoin fear factors, leadership, markets, interest, this is where even our insults come from. That's how you can tell Bitcoiners, shitcoiner, that's the reason why these things are insults, right? That's why Bitcoiners use them as insults. And if you look at how these things are playing out, these are actually the things that need to be managed better. And these are the things that Bitcoiners are already managing. And I'll remind you, there's a quote by Einstein, right? So a quote by Einstein, and here it is. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it. So he has an hour to solve a problem and his life depends on it, right? I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper questions to ask. He's a pretty smart guy, right? So he's got an hour to live. He's willing to allot 90 whatever % of the time to just asking the right questions, right? Now, that's what I think of when I see these two preoccupations with fear contrasted against each other, fiat fears and Bitcoin fears. And what I see here are the appropriate questions to ask going forward. And that's my answer to Punk 6529 now, is that I think he's misallocated how much fear, or I think he hasn't gauged the power of fear to persuade people, move them, and motivate them, and what the majority of Americans now fear, and that Bitcoin aligns with the majority of Americans' fears. Americans might have had these as fears, but they live in them now. They live in it, right? They're starting to fear poor leadership. They're starting to fear the market screwing them, right? Poverty is actually becoming fear of the markets, right? Status as a fear, where are you? Did you go to the school? Is actually now just, are people interested in you? Like, lack of popularity would kill Bitcoin. That's why we're afraid of it, right? That's why we're afraid of the dopamine dealers, because they're really good at hooking people's attention and getting them to follow. So the three things that Bitcoiners are most afraid of are actually properly calibrated and more sensitive to the fears that people have today, and therefore will help answer their fears, and therefore will become the obvious path for people going forward, because only Bitcoin can manage these fears. These ones here are done. They're the old world. They're old swear words. Just like England had its old Victorian swear words, these are the old ones, right? Fears change. The reasons why you're afraid changes. Just like the logic of violence changes, right? It's the same argument as the logic of violence changing, except now we're talking about what motivates people the most, and that's fear. And that the things that people are afraid of today, Bitcoin can answer. It's just a process of turning these fears into the most obvious ones. And the election changes, the races, the very clear contrast between parties, the utter manipulation and obvious manipulation of markets, and finally, attention spans and what people are interested in. So that's the story for today, guys. Let's see if I had any other comments. Well, that's all I got, guys. Couple comments. Bob the Builder, the monetary system, can we fix it? I think so. I think we've already fixed it, team. We're there. We're waiting. All right, guys. Peace.